minutes left.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this lecture. Your Constitutional Court is much more famous than I am, and your Constitutional Court is also very famous in Europe, and not only as a Constitutional Court which is very active, but also a Constitutional Court which is very open to the constitutional systems of other countries. So I think you are also listening to the constitutional debates in Europe, and I will speak in English, but I asked that this PowerPoint presentation can be made available to all of you, and it's just a summary of a book which was published last year, and you find thousands of books about constitutional law all over the world, but I think this is so far the only book which discusses constitutional law from the perspective of multi-level constitutionalism, and this is due to a paradigm change, which most people still ignore, but I think which also requires a paradigm change of constitutional law. That is, constitutions, and today all 193 UN member states have adopted national constitutions. Constitutions are adopted in order to provide public goods. And public goods have completely changed due to globalization. Most public goods have become international public goods. They are no longer only national public goods. So think of human rights, rule of law, of international trading system, monetary system, environmental protection, of international peace in Colombia. And here, the fact that globalization has transformed national public goods into international public goods, which no state can protect unilaterally without international law, without international institutions, this has completely changed the task of constitutional law. So we see that there are hundreds of international organizations like the United Nations, like the World Trade Organization, but these organizations are very imperfect. They are disconnected from citizens, they are disconnected from national parliaments, they are disconnected from national constitutional courts, and they do not protect public goods effectively. That's the reality. So climate change is happening, but the Paris Agreement on climate change prevention is very unlikely to prevent climate change. The World Trade Organization is a very sophisticated multilateral treaty protecting a liberal world trading order, but you see President Trump ignoring all the rules, ignoring the dispute settlement system, and here we have a huge challenge, and the emphasis of this book is on methodology. So I'm not claiming to know the truth, I just argue that we have to broaden and to review our traditional thinking about constitutional law and to take into account this new paradigm of globalization. So let me start by just explaining that modern constitutional law, for example, as taught by Professor Alexi, and I have been told that you are a disciple of Professor Alexi. I mean, modern constitutional law is justified by Professor Alexi by the constitutional contract among citizens who recognize each other as having constitutional rights, as having human dignity. But then, after this initial conclusion of a constitutional contract, one of the most important existential questions of constitutional law is this first question: how to produce the private and public goods necessary for human survival and development. And public goods, I come to that later, includes also human rights, or what President Roosevelt in 1941 explained as the four freedoms with which President Roosevelt justified the participation of the United States in the Second World War. The four freedoms, according to President Roosevelt, were the freedom of opinion, the freedom of religion, the freedom from fear, and the freedom from want. Freedom from want depends on access to goods like medicines, food, water, housing, and so far. So private goods are spontaneously supplied through markets, provided markets are properly regulated, that to protect legal freedoms, private property, contract law. But the reality remains that in all countries there are lots of market failures. One example is tobacco. The consumption of tobacco in the last century has killed more than 100 million people, more than the First and Second World War together and all the civil wars and genocides of the last century. So here private markets are of existential importance for a democracy, but they are inadequately regulated all over the world. Public goods are not spontaneously provided in private markets because public goods are defined by their capacity of being non-rival. They are available for everyone. Think of human rights. Human rights are a right of every human being. And public goods are non-exhaustible. That is, you can use human rights. All 7 billion people can use human rights every day. They cannot be exhausted. So we need collective supply of public goods through governance, through legal systems. And here we have what philosophers call the paradox of freedom. Market freedoms or political markets are crucially important, but they have the tendency to destroy themselves. That is something which many people ignore. If you look back to history over the past 4,000 or 5,000 years, there have been 5 different methods of providing public goods, and these methods continue to be applied. There's feudalism, feudal governments. For example, in China for 3,000 years, all the Chinese emperors have invoked a mandate of heaven, and the current Chinese party is more or less continuing this ideology, this is feudalism. The second method is democratic constitutionalism, which started 2,500 years in ancient Athens, and democratic constitutionalism emphasizes the need to enhancing input legitimacy through democratic governance, through democratic assemblies, and so far. But as we all know, the democratic constitution of Athens was later on overthrown by power politics, by foreign power politics, which remains a reality in international relations. The third method is republican constitutionalism. And again, that was initiated 2,500 years ago in ancient Rome. And the Romans did not speak very much of democracy. They emphasized more the need to enhance output legitimacy through protection of public goods. But as we know, also the Roman Republic was overthrown through power politics. The fourth method is a rather modern method which emerged after the Second World War. That is a cosmopolitan constitutionalism. Today, all 193 UN member states have recognized human rights, rule of law, democracy, and these are principles recognized in many UN human rights conventions. But again, as you know, they are not effectively protected inside many UN member states. So the fifth method is multi-level constitutionalism, which over the past 70 years emerged in Europe, first in the context of the European Convention on Human Rights, then the European Community Law, then the law of the European Economic Area. And some constitutional lawyers explain this emergence of multi-level constitutionalism as one phase of the emergence of constitutionalism, that is to build, in Europe at least, what somebody called a 5-story house. So if you take human rights, or if you take economic law, human rights are protected if you live in Germany or if you live in Switzerland in federal states. They are protected at the local stage, in your local community. They are protected at the cantonal stage. They are protected at the national level. They are protected at the European level. And of course, the European members are also part of the European Human Rights Convention. So you have 5 levels of multi-level governance protecting, for example, the European common market, or the liberal world trade order, or human rights. But the question then is, how do you conceptualize this multi-level legal system? And let me just give you one example by citing a case decided by the European Court of Justice some years ago, the Omega case. And the Omega case started in Bonn, a little tiny town in Germany, where the town council decided to prohibit laser drones. I'm 73 years old, so but I know you are all young and you probably know what is a laser drone. So this dispute was about a conflict between international economic law and human rights law. And here in Bonn, there were laser drones where people imported laser games, and these laser games are about the killing of people, and you play killing of people in these laser drones. And the game was imported from the United Kingdom, so the supplier invoked the market freedoms of European community law. And some games also came from outside, so they could invoke the World Trade Organization agreement on GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Service, and say the importation of these games is a legal obligation of Germany. The town hall of Bonn decided, no, we consider these laser games to be inconsistent with the idea of human dignity, and we don't want these kinds of games. So they prohibited the importation of these laser games in violation of EU law, the common market law, in violation of the GATS agreement of the World Trade Organization, and the judges had to decide how to balance human rights law with the international economic law, and the case went up to the European Court of Justice. And the economists said, oh, you cannot accept this restriction of the importation of services, because the little town of Bonn, that's practically the only little community in Germany which prohibits these laser games. If you go 30 kilometers away to the town of Cologne, you can play these laser games. And the judges decided in favor of the little town of Germany, of Bonn. And even the European Court of Justice respected that human dignity is a common constitutional principle of national constitutional law, of European constitutional law, and of UN human rights law. And human dignity has to be interpreted with due respect to the diversity of people. So if a town council in Bonn decides this is against our conception of human dignity to simulate killing in these laser drones, this is, we have to respect it. So this is just one example for this subject of multi-level constitutionalism, of conflicts between multi-level human rights law, here for example the human right to dignity, which is protected in Article 1 of the German Constitution, and also in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, and international economic law. Now, in order to take a position, in order to help you to take your own opinion, how to evaluate such kinds of conflicts, I think the first point is to say this is not about truth. This is about constitutional values which may differ from one town to the other, and from one level of regulation to the other level of regulation. But in order to evaluate these kinds of conflicts, which we see today everywhere in the world, I think I want to briefly explain my conception of constitutionalism, and you will probably have very different traditions and conceptions, but nonetheless, I think it is very important to be aware that now all 193 UN member states have adopted national constitutions, And this has given rise to an internationalization of human rights law and of constitutional principles, which you find in UN human rights conventions or in European Union law. And in addition to that, we see that the globalization of public goods has given rise to hundreds of international organizations, and some of these organizations are based on what is called a treaty constitution. So if you look at the agreement establishing the International Labour Organization, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the UNESCO, or the International Telecommunication Union, they are all called constitutions because they constitute governance powers, they limit governance powers, they regulate governance powers, they justify governance powers. And at the regional level, we see that not only in Europe, but also in the Andean Common Market or in Latin American human rights law, we see the emergence of multi-level human rights law, multi-level constitutional law, multi-level judicial systems. Now, the constitutional contract theories underlying this multi-level constitutionalisms, justifying why you constitute governance powers, limit governance powers, regulate and justify governance powers beyond the state, these theories remain very controversial. So the Hobbesian theory was a utilitarian theory. So Hobbes said the people conclude a social contract, establish an absolute monarchy with absolute powers and give up all their fundamental rights. But that was a very strange theory. And since Immanuel Kant or since John Rawls, the most famous Anglo-Saxon philosopher of the last century, these constitutional contract theories are interpreted as rights-based theories. And I think what is important here is to emphasize the reality of constitutional pluralism. All national constitutional systems differ from each other. Why? Because the social, the economic, the political and legal systems interact, they are different, people are very diverse, is a human right to self-determination, to respect margins of appreciation. Judicial administration of justice differs from one country to the other. So constitutional pluralism is a reality, but one other dimension of constitutionalism is a dynamic dimension. That is, constitutionalism involves a mandate to the legislature, to the executive, to the judiciary, to start a dynamic process of transforming the constitutionally agreed principles of justice, like human rights, into a treaty, into a written constitution, into legislation, into executive regulations, into judicial rulemaking, and not only at the national level, but also at the international level. So here, this constitutionalization process is a very dynamic and very incomplete and very imperfect and very contested process. The two main obstacles are what John Locke, the famous English philosopher, called the Lockean dilemma, that we need constitutionalism inside states, restraining the powers of legislatures, executives, and governments. But as long as international relations are dominated by power politics, the foreign policy powers usually are very difficult to constrain. And that is one problem. And the second problem is what I call the democratic disconnect of worldwide organizations like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization. That is, these organizations are not effectively controlled by any parliament, by any court, by citizens. And here is, you find democratic lack of accountability, lack of judicial accountability, ineffectiveness, abuses of power everywhere. So the response to this dilemma is, I think, what you see in regional systems. The regional human rights conventions, regional treaties like the European Union Treaty or the treaty establishing the European Economic Area, or the Andean Common Market Tribunal. And here, I mean, in Europe we have a very comprehensive jurisprudence on how to protect human rights. I mentioned the Omega case as an example. Much more famous is the Cadi jurisprudence, where Mr. Qadi, a very rich millionaire living somewhere in Saudi Arabia, was the target of UN Security Council sanctions, and the European Court of Justice refused to implement these UN Security Council sanctions inside the European Union because Mr. Qadi was not given all his due process of law protection and his human rights safeguards in this proceeding. But the point remains, I think, that this dynamic process of constitutionalization remains very fragmented, very imperfect. So the aim is not to create some kind of super constitution at the international level, but to progressively limit abuses of public powers, limit abuses of private powers, limit governance failures, limit market failures, which we see everywhere. And here human rights law nonetheless has become universally recognized, and in some regions like Latin America, Africa or Europe, it has been implemented more effectively than in other regions. But what you should not neglect is the reality of modern cosmopolitan law. Modern cosmopolitan law is applied all over the world. Think of private contract law, private commercial law, private investment law, international criminal law, labor law, health law. Here, I mean, commercial contracts can be enforced all over the world on the basis, for example, of the New York Convention on the Recognition of Foreign Arbitral Awards. Investment arbitral awards can be enforced all over the world on the basis of the convention setting up the International Settlement, International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. So here we are already, I mean, seeing the reality of cosmopolitan law in the field of human rights, in the field of economic law. International criminal law is, of course, a very difficult subject in Colombia. Another point which I want to emphasize is the distinction between legal, political, and sectoral constitutionalization. So constitutions usually start as a legal constitution constituting a people, the national legal order, and the national legal system, but the political constitution may be completely different. So if you take the example of China, China adopted a legal constitution in 1982, but no court in China is allowed to apply this constitution. No citizen in China is allowed to invoke this constitution and the constitutional rights in any court. So here the political constitution, the real political power structures in China are completely different from the legal constitution. And then we see in Europe that in addition to a legal and political constitution, you need sectoral constitutions. That is, you need to limit abuses of power in certain sectors like the economy. So the European Union has a microeconomic common market constitution based on competition law, on social law, on environmental legislation, on a system of competition authorities among 28 countries. And it has a macroeconomic monetary constitution for those countries which have adopted the euro as a common currency. So there is a European Central Bank, there is a system of cooperation between the national central banks and the European central banks. And this sectoral constitutionalism is also visible in other areas. So we have, for example, a foreign policy constitution in Europe, which is quite impressive because if you compare the foreign policy constitution of the United States and the foreign policy constitution of the European Union, these are two different worlds. In the United States, the Congress has delegated almost dictatorial powers to the president. You see that President Trump is now violating all WTO rules, imposing sanctions in complete violation of the law, blocking the appointment of appellate body judges, and disrupting a lot of other multilateral treaty systems like the Paris Agreement or climate change prevention. In Europe, the Lisbon Treaty of 2009 explicitly prescribes that in the area of external relations, the EU must respect human rights, must respect rule of law, must respect democratic governance. So it is what I call the cosmopolitan constitution, but of course the reality looks quite different. But here it is important, I think, to be aware that this sectoral constitutionalism responds to the particular collective action problems which we find in particular sectors, like the economy, like foreign relations, like health protection. And here my book, and I sent an electronic version of my book to Maria Carmelina, and she's willing to, or you can ask a copy of the electronic version of the book from her. And I define this notion of multi-level constitutionalism here as a normative proposition, a normative democratic theory, that law and governance, in order to be accepted by citizens as legitimate and voluntarily complied with, need to be justified vis-à-vis citizens through agreed principles, rules, and institutions of a higher legal rank. And they must be transformed into constitutional and democratic legislation, administration, adjudication, international public goods treaties, so as to institutionalize public reason. That is what John Rawls emphasized in his book about democratic liberalism. The need to institutionalize public reason in order to help citizens to remain active democratic citizens. And here John Rawls, in his book on the theory of justice, speaks of a four-stage process of constitutionalization. So you began in the United States with the Declaration of Independence, then you had the adoption of the US Constitution, then you have democratic legislation transforming the constitutional principles into legal rules and institutions, and then you have administrative judicial rules. But I think it's much more appropriate to speak today of a six-stage constitutionalization process, because national law is no longer sufficient for protecting public goods. All major international public goods depend on international law and international institutions. And here I think we have to create a multi-level constitutional system which is, must remain very pluralistic and which remains confronted with a paradox. On the one side, and I have studied economics under Friedrich Hayek, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics many years ago, and who always told that markets are so complex as decentralized information mechanisms, coordination mechanisms, sanctioning mechanisms. That is, I think, crucial importance for the functioning of markets. So the paradox here is that on the one side you apply a constructivist approach of constitutionalism, democratic legislation, and then the six-stage constitutionalization process. But on the other side, we have to admit the limits of knowledge, or what Hayek called our rational constitutional ignorance, and the pretense of knowledge in communist countries who claim to know all the details of the economy and in reality completely ignore the interests and the preferences and the demand of citizens. So here you have a constructivist legal approach, but the basic objective is to protect decentralized economic markets, decentralized political markets. And here to realize this for the protection of transnational public goods remains a huge challenge, I think. And let me just mention why. First, public goods differ from one public good to the other. So there are economists who say there is one category of what they call best shot public good. And that may be the most easiest category. So if you want to invent a medical treatment for malaria or for polio, I mean, that can be done unilaterally by a powerful country like the United States by subsidizing research and so far. Then there is a second category of what they call weakest link public goods. Think of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So there are today about 8 or 9 countries in the world with nuclear weapons, but this is relatively easy as long as you control the weakest links, the pariah states like North Korea or Pakistan. But the most difficult public goods are what is called aggregate public goods. So public health, for example, peace, the trading system, the monetary system, the environmental system, they are all aggregate public goods which can be effectively protected only if you protect them at the local stage, at the national stage, at the regional stage, and at the worldwide stage. And here, these treaty constitutions, like the International Labour Organization, World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, and the UNESCO, they refer to human rights, ILO, labor rights, World Health Organization, human right to health, FAO, the human right to food, UNESCO, human right to education. But unfortunately, the reality remains that these worldwide institutions remain dominated by power politics. General international law teaches you the customary rules of treaty interpretation as codified in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, teach you that these multi-level legal systems should be interpreted in mutually coherent ways, but the reality remains that at the World Trade Organization nobody ever mentions human rights. And in the UN, the UN human rights law is not effectively implemented in many UN member states. So here, one remedy to this problem is to transform these global public goods into what is called a club good. The WTO is a club, that is, members may join the WTO only on the condition that they liberalize and regulate trade in certain ways. Or the Andean Common Market or the European Community, these are clubs which admit members only on condition of respect for certain common market regulations, for human rights and so far. So here, I think nonetheless you have to ask yourself, why are most books on international economic law, most books on United Nations law still written from this perspective of the rulers, of the states as the most important guardians of public good? When I published this book on international economic law in the 21st century 6 years ago, that was at the moment when we had the human rights revolution in Tunisia. And the human rights revolution in Tunisia was triggered by a poor person, Mohamed Bouazizi, who tried to sell fruits in a local market and was prevented by the police from selling his fruit. And he then committed suicide as a protest against the suppression by the government of the human right to earn a living. And I told myself, I will write this book from the perspective of a poor person selling food or here flowers in a market. This is a famous painting by Diego Rivera describing a poor woman selling flowers in a Mexican market. And these markets are, of course, imperfect and dominated by lots of abuses of power. But I think the basic idea which you have to confront is that if you write about international economic law, if you write about international intellectual property rights, if you write about United Nations law today, then you have to ask yourself what kind of legal methodology do you want to apply? Do you want to apply a legal methodology taking human rights seriously, that is, recognizing human dignity, human rights as the principal value that law and governance derive their legitimacy from human rights and popular sovereignty, that people delegate only limited powers to governments, and that the mandate is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and that human rights law has become universally recognized. And I think here there are a lot of empirical reasons and a lot of normative reasons why nowadays, if you write about Andean common market law, for example, or about protecting transitional justice in Colombia, or about protecting intellectual property rights and human rights in Colombia, there are very good empirical reasons and normative reasons why we should take a constitutional approach. So the first empirical reason is that globalization has transformed national into transnational aggregate public goods. And here that human rights law suggests we, the citizens, are the constituent power. We are the democratic principle, and we should be the main agents responsible for holding governments accountable for abuses of power. Then the second reason, I think, is the fact that UN law and WTO law do not protect global public goods effectively. These are intergovernmental organizations where you see abuses of power everywhere. And if you look today to President Trump, he's constantly lying. He's constantly mixing his private interests, business interests with public interests. He's violating multilateral treaties anytime. He's undermining judicial accountability. So here there is an empirical problem with our current governance methods. The third empirical evidence is that citizen-driven network governance, for example, in global supply chains, in the climate change governance which enabled the Paris Agreement on climate change, in human rights treaties, citizen-driven network governance is much more powerful, has proved to be much more powerful than authoritarian top-down governance. And the fourth reason is, of course, that disregard for human rights creates negative externalities. That is obvious in Colombia. You see it with Venezuela and the 1 million of refugees from Venezuela entering Colombia. These are negative externalities of the persistent violation of human rights in Venezuela. So there are also normative reasons why constitutionalism here is, I think, the best legal methodology. However, without, prejudging how you want to define constitutionalism. Constitutionalism in Colombia certainly has to be defined in a very different way than from Venezuela, but also from Germany or the United States. So the legal constitution limiting, regulating, and justifying the basic legal order of people, must reflect the particular principles of justice, and your peace agreements reflect very contested, very particular principles of transitional justice. But the true challenge then is to institutionalize these principles of justice. So John Rawls published his famous theory of justice in 1971 and said there are two basic principles of justice. But then later on in 1993, he published his famous book on democratic liberalism, where he said, oh, I made a big mistake. And I admit that the most difficult task is not to agree on a constitutional contract and define the constitutional principles of justice appropriate for our society, but the most difficult part is to institutionalize public reason and to limit this abuse of power, the bounded rationality which we see everywhere. The second normative function of constitutionalism is very often neglected. That is, this constitutional mandate for governments through constitutional, legislative, administrative, judicial, and international institutions. So constitutionalism is not only about a legal or political constitution. The underlying idea is some kind of ideal constitution. And if you look at the current American administration, for example, the Congress, American Congress, adopted a trade promotion authority in 2015 defining the task of the executive as being the implementation of the WTO agreement. That was the constitutional and democratic mandate given in the Trade Promotion Act of 2015, but what Mr. Trump does is exactly the opposite. He's threatening to withdraw from NAFTA. He is violating WTO rules persistently, ignoring the dispute settlement system. So here, the tension between the normative mandate, the democratic mandate, and the reality remains huge. But constitutionalism, above all, is a legal methodology. And it's a methodology not only for designing law and institutions, but also for interpreting law and institutions. And here, you know that the legal theory of Professor Hart emphasizes what he calls the rules of recognition, change, and adjudication. That is, the rules which define how we identify law. And here, if you look at international law, we know that Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice defines international law as treaties among states, customary law, and general principles of law. But the relationship between these three sources is very contested today. And the European law evolved mainly by national courts and European courts recognizing that human rights have become general principles of international law, that constitutional principles limit all governance powers at national and international levels, and here the legal methodology, however you define legal methodology in your constitutional approach, I think is and remains a huge problem. So from a historic perspective, I think it is useful to clarify that constitutionalism started as an emancipatory constitutionalism, for example, in the 18th century, the American Human Rights Revolution, the French Human Rights Revolution. But then today's human rights constitutionalism, which I call constitutionalism 2.0, is already based on human rights law at worldwide, regional, and national levels. And in Europe, we have developed sectorial constitutionalism 3.0, like the economic market constitution, the monetary constitution, which extend constitutionalism beyond human rights to other fields of governance. And the big question is, will it be possible to constitutionalize multi-level governance of international public goods in the United Nations, in the WTO? And here I think we have to recognize that on the one side, human rights, rule of law, and democracy have become part of UN law, but they are not effectively implemented. Second, we have to recognize, and most judges are not aware of simply neglecting this, we have to recognize that national constitutions have become partial constitutions. National constitutions can no longer protect the public goods demanded by citizens. So multi-level governance based on international law is necessary for protecting international public goods. The third point here is also that this transformation of national into transnational public goods as a result of globalization remains neglected by many academics, by many politics. So Mr. Trump just denies climate change, or he denies that the past 70 years the United States was a leader for the multilateral trading system, and that this has benefited enormously also to the United States. Then the fourth challenge is how to justify international law more coherently vis-à-vis citizens so that we can avoid this populism. And I think that's a huge challenge for Colombia and your peace agreement. And here, again, it's important to emphasize constitutionalism is not about truth. Constitutionalism is about constitutional values accepted by the citizens. And your peace agreement will be successful if the government and the constitutional court and the politicians can persuade the citizens, yes, certain compromises, certain transitional justice principles are necessary, and you have to explain and justify why you make certain compromises. But this is a very, very difficult task, and if you are not capable of persuading the citizens, you will see populism as we see it now in the United States. And populism in the United States, we no longer have an effective market economy, because Mr. Trump, just by executive order, he imposes tariffs on the whole world in violation of international rules, and he distorts market competition systematically. So here, I think we have a huge constitutional challenge, In my book, I use two case studies. I don't have the time to explain to them. One is the free trade agreement between the European Union and Canada. And this free trade agreement in the beginning, for 7 years, was negotiated secretively, far away from the citizens. And when the text was finally published, the citizens objected. And the Commission said, yes, we cannot impose it on the citizens. We need the consent of the European Parliament. So they engaged in a public consultation, and in the public consultation you had almost 150,000 replies, which were negative, to more than 90% negative. So the investment rules were completely renegotiated, and then you had several court rulings, the most recent court ruling from March this year that investor-state arbitration is not consistent with European law among the 28 EU member states. So that is also a constitutional ruling which, I mean, is, I think, also topical in Colombia. Is investor-state arbitration as provided for in the treaties between Colombia and France, is that compatible with your constitutional system? And the answer is very open. And here, the lesson from this case study is that you are much more powerful if you respect constitutional rules, if you engage citizens, if you conduct policies transparently in support with citizens. Second case study is tobacco consumption. As I mentioned, in the last century, more than 100 million people were killed by toxic tobacco products. Tobacco companies have been lying over the health effects of tobacco for more than 50 years. But what is encouraging now is that the World Health Organization has concluded its Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, accepted by more than 190 states, and that we see an increasing number of investment arbitral tribunals deciding against the tobacco companies, protecting the human right to health, protecting the sovereign duty to protect public health. You have had 6 weeks ago a WTO ruling against tobacco exporting countries, protecting the human right to health. So here I think more and more countries and national courts act in conformity with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and limit the abuses of tobacco consumption. So I think cosmopolitan constitutionalism is a very realistic policy, even if it sounds a little bit philosophical. It was invented by Immanuel Kant in his little book on perpetual peace. But the empirical evidence is that cosmopolitan agreements in the field of competition law, investment law, labor law, commercial law, contract law, global supply chains have been much more effective than top-down governance. So, of course, there are limitations to this constructivist approach. Let me just mention briefly, and I'm approaching the end, so I will stop in 3 minutes. I think it's better to discuss than to give monologues. But here, constitutional constructivism, of course, has obvious limits. And the first limit is what philosophers describe as the human condition. I mean, we are all rational egoists who in many situations, I mean, do not act in a very reasonable manner. And so I think the idea of global democracy, of global justice, that is probably a constitutional dream which will be very difficult to realize for a long time. Second, we see the reality that international organizations continue to be dominated by intergovernmental power politics. Mr. Trump is a very sad example for this. We see, third, that UN and WTO governments remains disconnected. No parliament effectively controls what is happening there. Citizens do not effectively control courts, do not hold the UN or WTO accountable. So the law in the books is quite different from the law in action. And fourth, the collective action problems differ from one area to the other. So we need this sectoral constitutionalism And we need to be very modest about how to protect climate change, for example. It's an extremely complex subject. So, 5 policy conclusions. I think in the 21st century, we should apply a constitutional approach saying multi-level governance of public goods in the UN and in the WTO should no longer be left to intergovernmental power politics. It should be seen as a democratic relationship between citizens, which must hold governments accountable, which have human rights, which have human rights of access to justice. And it is a principal-agent relationships where we, the citizens, have the principal responsibility. Second, the customary rules of treaty interpretation require consistent interpretation of national and international legal systems, with due respect for what the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties explicitly says in Article 31 in the preamble, with due respect for human rights and principles of justice. But principles of justice are very complex. There are procedural principles of justice, constitutional principles of justice, distributive principles of justice, corrective justice, commutative justice, equity. So we will never agree on any comprehensive theory of justice because we are all diverse. And here, nonetheless, as you see in Colombia with transitional justice, we cannot ignore justice. And we have to persuade citizens to accept certain principles of justice which the citizens here in this particular complex can accept. Fourth conclusion, that we have to develop democracy not only as representative parliamentary democracy, but much more important as constitutional democracy, participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, where citizens must assume responsibility not only for the local institutions at home, but also for multi-level governance of public goods. Final conclusion, comparative institutionalism and empirical evidence confirm the need for multi-level democratic, republican, cosmopolitan rights as constitutional restraints on foreign policy powers. But here the global system remains an extremely complex economic, political and legal system, and we must remain very modest and recognize our constitutional ignorance. But nonetheless, we have to struggle for principles of justice and for limiting abuses of power. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. I wonder if someone would like to ask a question.